for this year is about stories, and I know that you enjoy and find stories very easy to tell. Now, let me start by asking this question about, well, stories as opposed to reality, as opposed to the truth, as opposed to what is, objective, absolute truth. If we can ever capture it in words, I don't believe that we can, but we strive sometimes to. And some people refrain from using stories because they think, well, my work is more focused on what is real, not what is made up. So, in that context, how do you think stories are important when we are talking with people whose worldview is about, I don't want stories, I want reality, I want what is real, I don't want what is fake, I want what is the truth? Can stories serve us in that respect?
The short answer to that last bit is definitely yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely, 100%. There's a lot of really interesting points that you've put in that sort of opener. And I think the first thing is I want to agree with you that we can't really get at the truth. I've just realised I forgot to shut the door. Can you give me half a minute to shut the door?
Sure.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that truth is different things to different people. And as someone who holds quite strong beliefs in certain areas, I find it really difficult to accept that somebody else can equally strongly believe the complete opposite and see it as truth. Objectively, I know that obviously that's possible. But personally, I do sometimes find it difficult to understand why somebody believes the complete opposite to me. But I guess that's just a failing on my part of, empathizing successfully with people who hold opposing views. I try, but
I suppose it's when we think about, well, when we're talking about truth, what truth about what? So truth about our beliefs, well, we don't know because a belief is constructed. Whereas truth in terms of, like, let's say a car, which car is faster than another? There is like a truth about that because we can measure it, and that it won't, regardless of who tests those cars out, they will come to the same conclusion because they've tested it out, and we can make a generalization that X, this model of, the Vauxhall course, this model is faster than that model, and there is no subjectiveness about it. It's not a story that we've made up. This is a fact. Whereas, when we're talking about a belief, in that case, there is, our beliefs, we may believe that our belief is true, but somebody else may have a counter belief that is equally true to them. So we can't generalize from the truth we have in our beliefs about concepts rather than something which is tangible, right?
Yeah. And I agree. I think that's why I agree with you that we can't always get to the truth, because one person's truth is often going to be different to another person's truth. But I think the point about the stories that we tell ourselves are they true? I mean, I personally, funnily enough, I had this conversation with somebody yesterday. She made a little joke about, well, you'll have to threaten to sing to them. And I just went, oh no, I don't sing in public. Mm-hmm. And that's because I've got a long-held childhood belief that I'm not a good singer. And that if I make myself vulnerable and sing in front of people, they will laugh at me in the same way that people laughed at me back when I was at school and I did some singing. So no, I don't sing in public. But is it actually true that I'm not a good singer? Or was it just those kids being mean? But I've just taken that belief and carried it with me all these years, and I still won't sing in public.
Well, the scientific answer to that is, well, test it out. Ask people, ask them for feedback, see if audition for something and see who wins. And, so there is the scientific method of, like, we make an observation either about others or about ourselves, and then based on that observation we form an assumption about it based on, you know, the feedback we've received. Either we assume that the feedback is true, it's not true, and then we test it out, and then we, you know, we change our theory, you know, about, am I a good singer, am I not a good thing? We change our theory based on the feedback that we received. We test it out again, and then we draw another conclusion, and then we make recommendations. Well, maybe I need to go and get some lessons in singing if I want to be a good singer, you know. So that's kind of like it's called the scientific approach, I suppose. The scientific methodology is that we make observations, we test them out, and then we adapt our beliefs, our theories based on you know, the experimentations that we've done and the feedback that we've received. So I remember when you talked about singing, and we're talking about identities here and our behavior in terms of our identity. I remember seeing a film about this woman who thought she was a brilliant opera singer, and no one was willing to tell her that she wasn't. And because she was very rich, she was able to kind of like organize her own opera concerts, and she thought that people were coming to listen to her because she was really good, but actually people were coming to listen to her because they were her friends, and they couldn't bear to tell her that she wasn't a good singer, including her husband. Her husband couldn't bear to tell her that she wasn't a good singer, and she was able to continue with this kind of facade, I suppose, based simply on the fact that her you know, her money, you know, meant that people were still attracted to be part of that story that she created, which we would, as you know, as audiences, we can see that she created a false identity for herself. It was not true. Her identity was not based on fact. Her identity was totally constructed. And I suppose sometimes we try and avoid that. We don't want ourselves to be behaving in a way which is only based on a story about ourselves rather than the facts about ourselves.
But what is the difference? I mean, that's where it becomes interesting, because when we're talking about identity, for her identity was, well, I'm a good singer.
Mm-hmm. But it wasn't.
And what she heard when she was singing was that she was a good singer. So you're right, it's a story that she had constructed for herself, but she believed it, and it became part of her identity, and the so others, strongly.
And the audience basically suffered, you know, and the reason they suffered is because, like I said, she was rich and influential, and therefore the benefit for them for suffering this was that they gained in other ways. You know, they gained through contact with her in other ways. But otherwise, if she hadn't been rich and powerful, she would not have been able to organize concerts for herself.
No, she probably would have gone on X Factor and had people laughing at her for good and forever on television.
Yes. So you see, that's where you know, it's the clash of worldviews, I suppose. There's our reality. Somebody who goes onto X Factor, they queue for days sometimes to get onto X Factor, and it's because their worldview is that they are, you know, the next Michael Jackson, or they are the next, you know, Diana Ross, or, you know, and then they go on stage and their story clashes with the story of the audience. The audience don't reflect back to them the truth of their story, and so it's sometimes it can be quite painful when our story is not confirmed by the outer world.
Yes, yeah, and I don't really know what you do with it. I mean, as a person, you've then got to take I guess take it on board that the story you've been telling yourself isn't right. But the way you do that is probably by constructing another story about yourself.
That's
or
right.
Possibly a story about all of those other people. Those other people are the ones who are wrong.
Absolutely, that's right.
What do they know? They don't know.
Right. Yeah, because they're just racist, aren't they? It's, you know, they can't see my greatness simply because they are biased against me, you know. So we can create a story about themselves, about the others, or we can create a story about ourselves. Well, actually, I'm I'm an idiot, or actually and even that is a false story. So we create, we had a fake story, and then we create another fake story, and it's not helpful either, because we go to the other extreme of thinking I'm absolutely hopeless, not only at singing but at everything in my life.
Yes, because then you're taking that thing that was potentially a big part of your identity. I mean, you do see people on X Factor, don't you, saying, oh, I've always loved singing since I was a little child, and I've always wanted to be, a superstar singer. And now they suddenly realise that reality is never going to happen. And because it was so central to their identity, they find it difficult to deal with. And I think, this is something that, if we can take it in a slightly different direction about identity, because this is something that I do find really quite fascinating. Mm-hmm. I've always identified as someone who has been overweight, struggles to stick to a diet, struggles to deal with exercise. And I first came across this concept of, altering your identity in order to change your behaviour in Atomic Habits by James Clear. And he says, well, identify as an athlete. And for a while, pre-lockdown, I wouldn't have gone as far as describing myself as an athlete, but I did start describing myself as a weight trainer, weightlifter, because for probably about 2 years, I consistently did a lot of weight training, 2-3 times a week, most weeks. It became a part of my normal exercise routine. But I think the struggle for me is that once something happened to take me out of that routine, i.e. lockdown, so all gyms closed, so I stopped the weight training, then the exercise kind of tailed off as well. So I've almost reverted back to the identity of, oh, well, I'm someone who struggles to stick to a good diet and to get regular exercise.
And I would say, yeah, and when that person said, well, identify with being an athlete, to me, that's what I'm talking about. That's not true. I'm not an athlete. That's a fake identity. Is it helpful to adopt a fake identity?
But I think by athlete, he means someone who exercises regularly. The context that it was in, it was just, if you exercise regularly, you're an athlete. You're not an elite athlete. You're not going to be in the next Olympics. And don't get me wrong, I never had any delusions that I would be, a weightlifting Olympic granny. That's that. I never had that as part of my identity. I know I'm not going to be, winning competitions. So, I wouldn't even consider entering competitions. But so my identity wouldn't have been as an elite athlete, but the exercise that I was doing on the regular basis and making improvements, yeah, I was an athlete at that point. I was regularly taking part in quite a tough exercise discipline and loving it, which is the really annoying thing. I absolutely loved it. And since gyms closed, I've kind of tailed off and not been able to consistently get back to it. So I think the reason I haven't consistently got back to it was because it wasn't enough of an ingrained identity, and I reverted back to the, you're overweight, you can't stick to a diet, you don't consistently exercise.
Remember that's only one part of your identity, because knowing you, I know that you identify very strongly with being a mother, with being a grandmother, with being a wife, and with having fun and communicating. So all of those aspects of your identity, there are values that you hold dearly based on those other parts of your identity, and your behavior is in alignment with your top values. And so the story about yourself being a good family person. That's a good story, isn't it? That's a good identity.
Yes, and you're absolutely right. That is one that's really important to me, and I'm secure in the knowledge that that's something that I always wanted to be part of my identity, wanted to be, I don't know, I can't think of the right word. Yes, it's just central to who I am. You're right.
Whereas
that's unshakable.
Whereas somebody who is an athlete and they spend 10 hours of their day every day, 7 days a week training, they might not identify with being a mother or or a wife, and so their top priority is about being in shape and being able to do what they need to do in order to win the next competition. And so that their behavior will be very different to your behavior, because your top priority is about family, it's about love, and spending time with your loved ones. I know you hold your weekend sacred because that's your family time, whereas somebody who's an athlete would be training on Saturdays and Sundays.
But what I think is interesting about exercise is that's part of looking after yourself, isn't it? And I think looking after yourself needs to be a priority for everybody, whether they're elite athletes, whether I do know someone who loves weight training, and that's his stress, that's what he does to get a little bit of an escape from work and an escape from his family responsibilities. He likes to go and do his weight training, and he's 4 times a week. He does give that a high priority because it's the only thing that he does really that gets him away from his work responsibilities and his family. And he's a very, very much a family man. He loves to spend time with his family too. So you can't say that
the thing about stories. Yeah, the thing about stories is that we have our own story, and then we compare our story with another person's story, and we think, well, they're similar to us in all these different ways, and yet he's behaving in a different way to me, and yet he's, I love family, he loves family, but he's behaving differently. And so there's that, the comparison. How does my story compare? How does it benchmark compared with another person's story? And I've done this myself as like when I first started coaching, I would be comparing what I'm doing as a coach with my other people who did the training at the same time as myself. Well, what's their story? What's my story? It's that their story seems to be a lot more fun and interesting and successful than my story. And it's like, we spend a lot of time comparing stories, and yet, our story can't ever be the same as someone else's story, because they're in a different context. If I want to get demotivated and demoralized, I would compare my story with Tony Robbins.
Oh no, I've never been a fan of Tony Robbins. I don't want to be like him at all.
No, not because I want to be like him. It's just because it's like he claims to have like all these millions of followers, and that there's probably a lot of truth in that, but he's in a totally different context. He is a different person to I am. And so therefore, that's an example of like comparing myself with someone who has, made a lot of money, but I can't possibly make money in the same way that that person makes money, because their identity is totally different. Their family life, their context, their whole, everything that makes them,
the history
is different. The history is different. So we do waste a lot of time comparing our story with other people's stories, although other people's stories can be very influential and inspirational at the same time.
I don't see how we can not compare ourselves to other people, even if, and I mean, the ideal is that we then accept that they are a different person with a different backstory, if you like, to ours, that's brought them to the place they're at, and our backstory has brought us to the place we're at. But I don't think you can avoid comparing what somebody else has done with what you're doing. I think it's part of our social identity, isn't it? That we look at where do we fit in? How do is somebody better at this than us, or are we better than them at us? a particular thing. We can't avoid comparisons, I don't think.
Yeah, we've had conversations before about social injustices and about the fact that women, for doing very similar jobs, don't get paid as much as men do. People from ethnic minorities don't get paid as much as their white counterparts, even though they may be more qualified, more experienced, they don't get paid the same. So there are those comparisons, but then we have to look at, well, what's our context again? It's not simply a question of comparing the outcomes that we have achieved. It's about, well, what has brought us to this point? And what has brought us to this point is a combination of our values, our behaviors, our skills, and not simply our qualifications and our experience, but how we've developed our skills and above all, who we think we are.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the story that we tell ourselves about how we got to this place, I mean, I think this is again where it becomes interesting, is because when we make those comparisons, we can tell ourselves, it's not fair, that person's got advantages that I haven't got, and I'm just going to sit here and sulk about the fact that they're doing better than I am. Or I'm going to accept that that person had those advantages and that's not right, but I'm going to react in this way. I'm going to deal with it in this way. So I think, again, that is part of the stories that we tell ourselves, isn't it? And that's part of how do we be happy? How can we be content with our lives? Are we content to be where we are and not worry about learning new things, progressing, moving on? Or do we want to be the best that we can be, starting from where we are now? What do we need to improve in ourselves, and what can we work on? And again, if we talk about comparing a true fact with a subjective story that we're telling ourselves, I mean, if I wanted to say, well, I'm only 5'1", I want to be 5'6", obviously that's, the 5'1" is a fact. It's probably going to get shorter rather than taller as I get older, but then I can say, well, I'm not happy with my performance in a particular area. I can learn a new skill, I can develop, I can progress in this, I can do something about this. So again, that is part of it's the self-talk, isn't it? It's the stories that we tell ourselves. How do we behave in the face of adversity?
Yeah, and it's a combination of both. So, for example, I'm never going to be 6 foot tall in this lifetime. That is a fact. There's nothing I can do. I can use my imagination as much as I like, but it's not going to change the fact that I'm never going to be 6 foot tall. And it's like the singer, the singer we started talking about, who thought she was a brilliant opera singer, but in fact she wasn't, based on her, like recordings. She could have listened back to recordings of her voice, but obviously she didn't. But she wasn't a good singer. And there was probably very little she could do about, changing that fact. The facts in terms of social injustice, there are facts. Women do get paid less than men if we compare the data. Ethnic minorities do get paid less for doing the same work. The pandemic has exposed these facts about different demographics. So there are facts, and there is the meaning. What is the story around those facts? Well, we can change the story, we can reinterpret the story about those facts, but there are some things that we can't do anything about. We can't do anything about where we live sometime. Well, okay, maybe we can move, but we can't change the fact that our current reality, these are facts about our current reality. It's not what we've constructed. They are facts. But there are things that we have constructed about, I might have chosen to live here. I did choose to live where I'm living at the moment. I made a choice, but there were very many facts that made me, or that pressurized me to make that particular choice. So it's a combination of facts and the choices, the constructed kind of choices, the decision making. Things I could do something about and things that I couldn't do something about.
Yeah, it's like that serenity prayer, isn't it? You know, I mean, I'm not religious. I'm actually atheist, but I do still like the sentiment of, you know, give me the strength. I think the serenity prayer is God, give me the strength. But, you know, give me the strength to accept what I can't change, change what I can change, and the wisdom to know the difference. And I think that bit at the end, you know, the wisdom to know the difference. And again, you know, to go back to the simple example of the deluded singer, you said that there probably isn't anything she can do about that. Well, she could take lessons. She could probably improve from where she is. But like I'm never going to be an Olympic athlete, she's probably never going to be the next Maria Callas either. But she could still learn to improve her skill, improve her voice, and learn to enjoy the fact that, you know, maybe she'd get asked to sing at somebody's wedding because she was good enough to sing at somebody's wedding, whereas not good enough to stand on a, you know, the opera house at Milan or wherever. Yeah. So even things like, you know, and again, to take the fitness analogy, I'm not going to be an Olympic weightlifter, but gyms are open again now. I could go back to the gym. I could start doing my weight training again. So I could improve my strength all over again. So there are things that you can do, even if you're not going to be elite.
Yeah,
that's it.
But as you say, it's having that wisdom to know the difference, and to, I suppose, even the wisdom to know our limitations as well, and to know our potential, but at the same time to know our limitations. So yes, you know, it's like, I think that's where it becomes problematic when people say, oh, just dream it and you can achieve it. You can be anything and anyone you want. And it's like, no, you can't. That's not true.
No. And this is a regular beef of mine with self-help books. A lot of the self-help books from years ago, sort of the 1980s, when I first started reading them, talked about positive thinking. And I would often finish the book and think it sounded perfectly logical, but how can me just saying, oh, it's fine, I'm happy, how can that work? Well, it doesn't. That just think positive doesn't work. Sometimes things happen that we're not happy about. You know, sometimes things happen that we are genuinely upset and sad about. And we need to acknowledge that that's how we feel.
It's a little bit like that stiff upper lip, you know, like, stiff upper lip, that identity of like being composed all the time. That is how I see positive thinking. It's like, well, we can't have a stiff upper lip all the time and say, oh, isn't everything wonderful? And just because we say everything is wonderful, everything is going to be wonderful. Sometimes we need to cry.
It's not. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I think I've tried to stop calling them self-help books. I tend to call them personal development books now, because I think they are more focused on developing yourself as a person. And some of them are called things like How to Be Happy. But the difference, I think, now is in the last 30 years or so, we have learned, well, I say we, I mean, I've learned a tiny bit. But, you know, psychologists and scientists have learned, and neurologists have learned so much about how the brain actually works, that they have found things that really do help you to think more positively. You know, they're not just saying, oh, think positively and things will be okay. They have shifted more towards, well, if you do things like this, if you focus on the positives, don't ignore the negatives, don't pretend they're not happening, but focus on the positives and do that on a regular basis. Do it by simple things like keeping a gratitude diary. Write down at the end of every day 3 things that happened today that you are grateful for. And even if that is like, well, this bad thing happened, but at least it wasn't worse in this particular way. You're grateful for the fact that it wasn't any worse. Okay, you had an accident and broke your leg, but you're grateful that you just broke your leg and didn't die.
That you only broke one leg.
Yes. And we are laughing about it as if it's quite but actually, and again, people have done studies on this and found that if somebody, I'm trying to think of, and again, stories, we're thinking about stories. Somebody was in a bank robbery and somebody got shot. So you can either take the view of, well, it's a bit bad. Oh, why me? Why did they happen to rob the bank when I was in there trying to withdraw my money to pay bills or whatever? Not that people do that much these days, but why did it have to happen when I was in the bank? Why me? Whereas somebody else can think, well, I know it's quite tragic that the money got stolen and somebody got shot, but at least they weren't killed. At least nobody was killed. So it's kind of a development of the glass half full or the glass half empty approach, I guess. But the research then shows that actually the person who thought, that was lucky, it was lucky it wasn't worse, is actually a happier, more successful person than the one who goes around thinking, why me? Why am I always so unlucky to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? So that attitude that we approach, that we take with us, the story that we tell ourselves about bad things that happen, does make a difference to our identity, to how we live our lives, how we go about our daily lives.
That's right. Yes. If we have an identity of if we identify with being a very lucky person, if we've always been told you're so lucky, and then we start to believe I'm so lucky, and you'd think that was a narrow escape, aren't I lucky? Whereas if we've formed an identity of I'm a victim, it's like things are always happening to me. So those two are sharp contrasting identities, aren't they? And it's more, I think it's helpful to believe that we're lucky rather than to believe that we're a victim. Although there might be, it doesn't mean to say that we're never going to be a victim in life. And sometimes we are a victim, and sometimes, but not all the time. I think it becomes, if it's chronic, if you don't realize that you are over attached to that identity of being a victim, and that everything that happens, you feel a victim. Whereas now and again, we can feel like, I've been victimized. You
can be a victim, but you don't have to adopt the victim mentality to go along with it. You don't have to go through your whole life believing that that's always going to be the case. So I think that's the difference, isn't it?
And I suppose also, likewise, feeling or identify with being, I'm so lucky, we can become Pollyannas then, and come across as not being genuine, because we're not responding in a sincere way. We're responding based on that facade, so again, even though it's a positive identity, it can still become a facade. It's like no one will know what we're really thinking, because they can even predict what we're going to say, because they know that, they know what the facade is, and so based on that facade, the behavior is predictable.
Yeah, it's that kind of fake positivity, isn't it? It's that, yes, something bad's happened, but it's fine, I'm going to cope and it will all be fine. It is that kind of fake positivity that doesn't actually change how you feel. But the fundamental approach to, acknowledging that, yes, something bad happened, it was scary, it was horrible, or it was sad, whatever emotion is, if you accept that happened, you know, and acknowledge how you feel, but not wallow in it, I guess. Not sort of let it define you. And I must admit, I often think this, you know, I mean, I've lost people. My parents are both dead. It was horrible at the time. I'm sad. You know, I was very depressed probably at the time, because I don't think I'd learned the coping mechanisms back then that I have now. And yeah, I still miss them, but I don't go through my whole life thinking I wish they were still here. You know, sometimes something happens and you just sort of think, oh, it'd be really funny to be able to tell my dad that, because I know he would laugh at that. But I don't, you know, sometimes you see people comment about, you know, oh, I still miss my mum so much. And I sit there and I think, she's been gone like 10 years or something. Why are you still living your life wishing she was here? Because you're not moving on, I think, in that way. That makes me sound really harsh and horrible, and that's not really what I mean. But I think if you constantly dwell on the fact that someone you love has gone, you're just missing out on life, and you are kind of making yourself into that almost a victim mentality, you know, because
it's as though when we lose someone, we have to reconstruct our story. And so the person who after 10 years is still missing their loved one, it's because they want their story to remain the same. And so where that person was, there's still that gaping kind of gap which they haven't filled with something else, because the story hasn't shifted in any way. You know, it probably has shifted, but they've still made sure that they leave that gap where the loved one was intact. And if we leave those gaps intact, as it were, we try and hold on to those gaps, you know, as they were, then that's why it's like, you know, when somebody, very often people will express having lost a loved one, it's like, say, oh, it's like somebody cut off one of my limbs. And it's like, well, yeah, somebody cut off one of your limbs, so it takes time for that wound to heal. But if we keep opening up that wound all the time, it's not going to heal then, is it? You know, we have to allow that wound to heal and for something else to take its place. Yeah.
I think you've articulated that really well. Yeah.
So in terms of mystery then, Lindsay, what is still mysterious? What is it that we need to know about the relationship between stories, creativity and culture that we still don't know, and it would be useful to know?
Yeah, I mean, obviously stories and culture go hand in hand. You know, if you think of sort of Indigenous peoples, Aborigines in Australia have all these stories about their culture that they, you know, continue to pass on through, you know, and obviously Indigenous peoples from loads of different places around the world. So I think stories and culture go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. But I think the creativity, what I find interesting about stories is our brains seem to be hardwired to retain that information, to act on it, to understand a concept better if it's related with a story. And I think, and again, just to sort of take creativity, you know, obviously storytelling is a creative act, especially if you are creating a fictional story. You know, it's a creative act. But what I find interesting is that if you lead with a story, if you give somebody a story, their brain retains that information and learns from that a lot more effectively than if you just present them with the facts. If you just, I mean, one of the things that I've done fairly recently is I actually wrote a few different ebooks. And the other thing is that I review books. As I said, I love personal development books and I review them. And at one point I started to think that I'm going to show you this book because this book It's called How to Be Happy at Work. Oh, I've got the light shining off.
Mhm.
How to Be Happy at Work. And it's a book that I would have loved to have written. You know, I would love to be able to help people be happy at work. So I was like, oh, first of all, I was like, oh, somebody's already done it. Damn. But then, okay, fine. What's she got to say? And I read this book and I was like, this is really hard going. The logic, the principles of what she's saying are quite plausible, logical. She's quoting research. You know, she's obviously done, I think she might have even done some of the research herself. I think she is a researcher at a US university. Why is this book so dull? And I realised that what she doesn't do is she didn't start it off with a story. That I've got other books up here that are on loads of different random things, and you'll pick the book up and you'll open it up and they'll start telling you somebody's story. And you're reading the story and you're thinking, where's he going with this? Why is this part? I don't understand how this is illustrating the thing that the book's about. But because it's a story, you keep reading it. So when I actually came to write my ebooks, I made a deliberate decision. I'm going to start with a story. I'm going to actually just go straight in, no introduction, no faffing around about what this book is about. I'll do that after. I'm going to open it with somebody's story, because that's what draws you in. It's absolutely the thing that makes the difference. And she doesn't do that. Mm-hmm. She starts off with all the facts and figures, and you get into it and I'm like, well, I'm bored now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because without the story, you can't see how it's relevant to you. So
I think the interesting thing for me is why is that? Why is the story so crucial? Why does the story engage when the information doesn't in quite the same way, even if it's information you're really interested in?
I suppose the story kind of creates an emotional connection. It kind of it evokes the emotion, whereas raw facts don't, the raw facts, unless they're really shocking, sometimes you can be presented with facts and those facts shock, and so therefore they evoke an emotion. But I suppose that's what it is. It's like we need to be stimulated in a way that has an impact on our emotional as opposed to simply our intellect.
Yeah, that is logical.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm pretty sure at some point I've read something that tells us why stories engage and facts don't in quite the same way. However, I can't remember what the answer was. But I think you're probably right that, because it creates that emotion in us. But it is something that I find really fascinating, and I think it'd be interesting to sort of see. I am interested in the scientific research. And I mean, even things like, those memory tricks, mm-hmm. when, you want to remember a whole series of random items, and then you create a story where Sarah walks into a house with a red door, and as she goes into the hall, there's a mirror on her left, and reflected in the mirror she can see. And by creating a story like that, you're then thinking that, okay, so the first object is door, mirror, whatever you see reflected in the mirror is you create the memory trick by creating a story. Mm-hmm. Even on that simple level, it works. Whereas just trying to think of the facts, like door, mirror, bookcase, you can't then link them by just trying to remember the names of them.
Yeah, so it's at that deep learning level that the deeper the meaning, the deeper the learning.
Yeah.
So isolated facts, it's like, I think, if you tell me 7 numbers, I'll probably be able to to remember those 7 numbers, or maybe 9 numbers, but
yeah, it's sort of around that.
Yeah. Whereas if you tell me a story that contains at least 50, 100 numbers, it's like, I'll probably remember them all if you tell me a story around it, because I can create a meaning about the story. And so it becomes, it's processed at a much deeper level. And so because they're all these facts are connected to each other into a story form, then it's easier to remember them and to memorize them. Yeah. Okay, well, brilliant. Okay, Lindsay, thank you. That was outstanding. I really enjoyed my conversation with you. And
it's really good to catch up with you and to like think about some of these ideas. Yeah.
Okie dokie. See you soon. Bye for now.
Yeah, take care. Bye now.
Bye.